Chapter 3 C. Era of Anglo-American Crisis. Chapter 3 C. Era of Anglo-American Crisis. From 1767 to 1773, Parliament pursued a confrontational policy that eroded Americans' trust of Britain. The resulting climate of fear and alienation left most colonies convinced that the Stamp Act had not been an isolated mistake, but part of a deliberate design to undermine colonial self-government. Still burdened by heavy taxes, the British public supported politicians, notably Charles Townshend and Lord North, who would compel Americans to contribute towards the cost of royal government in the colonies. One. The rise of Charles Townshend, 1765–1767. A comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. August 1766. King George III dismisses the Rockingham Ministry and invites William Pitt, Lord Chatham, to form a new government. B. March 1767. Due to Pitt's failing health, Charles Townshend becomes the facto leader of government policy. C. 1765. Background. The Quartering Act requires colonial assemblies to fund housing supplies for British troops. Becomes particularly contentious in New York. D. Early 1767. New York Assembly refuses to comply with the Quartering Act, provoking imperial backlash. E. October 1st, 1767. Townshend proposes a New York Suspending Act, threatening to invalidate all legislation passed by the New York Assembly unless it complies. F. Late 1767. New York appropriates funds just before the act becomes enforceable, avoiding formal sanction. Key characters. 1. William Pitt, Lord Chatham, initially a figure of colonial trust due to his opposition to the Stamp Act, incapacitated by illness. 2. Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, initially opposed the Stamp Act, but later pursued an assertive imperial taxation policy. 3. George III, monarch who shifts leadership to Pitt and then permits Townshend to implement more coercive policies. 4. New York Assembly, the colonial legislature resisting imperial demands under the Quartering Act. Quotations from key characters. Champagne Charlie on Townshend, a nickname reflecting his flamboyant oratory and reputed drunkenness, symbolic of his capricious leadership. The Quartering Act constituted an indirect task. Narrative observation. Important recognition of how colonial assemblies perceived British policy as fiscal overreach. British leaders would not hesitate to defend Parliament's sovereignty through the most drastic of all steps, interfering with colonial self-government, on British resolve. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. A shift from conciliatory to coercive imperial policy. Demonstrate a shift from conciliatory to coercive imperial policy even under leaders who had once criticized the Stamp Act. 2. The New York Suspending Act. The New York Suspending Act is a clear assertion of parliamentary supremacy over colonial self-rule, heightening fears of constitutional encroachment. 3. The emergence of administrative imperialism. It illustrates the emergence of administrative imperialism where compliance was enforced not just through taxation, but through the suspension of legislative autonomy. B. Economic consequences. 1. The Quartering Act indirectly taxed colonial resources. The Quartering Act indirectly taxed colonial resources, aggravating resentment without outwardly appearing as a fiscal imposition. 2. The cost of empire and the asymmetric burden on colonies. It underscored the cost of empire and the asymmetric burden on colonies like New York, where troops were heavily stationed. C. The symbolic implications. 1. Imperial arrogance and anti-American sentiment. The affair symbolized a broader imperial arrogance and anti-American sentiment within Parliament post-Stamp Act. 2. A conspirational intent to erode liberties. Townshend's policy reinforced colonial beliefs in a conspirational intent to erode liberties, especially through subtle fiscal controls. 3. Townshend Acts later in 1767. This episode set the stage for the Townshend Act later in 1767, deepening the ideological divide between Britain and its colonies. D. Conclusion. This segment reveals how the crisis of imperial taxation and sovereignty was not a single flashpoint, but a cumulative process. The case of Charles Townshend illustrates how individual leadership styles and political instability in London directly influenced colonial unrest, moving the colonies steadily closer to revolution. 2. Townshend's Financial Policies, 1767, a comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. Early 1767. British gentry slashed their own domestic taxes, intensifying the pressure on the treasury. B. 1767. Spring-summer. Charles Townshend introduces a suite of fiscal policies targeting colonial imports and trade. C. 1767 summer. Parliament passes the Revenue Act of 1767, commonly known as the Townshend Acts, imposing duties on imports such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. D. 1767. Creation of the American Board of Customs Commissioners to enforce the Navigation Act and curb smuggling. E. Post-1767. Implementation fails to yield expected revenues. only two generate significant income, and financial returns fall far short of projections. Key characters. 1. Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, initially opposed the Stamp Act but later pursued an assertive imperial taxation policy. 2. George Grenville, former Prime Minister, presciently warned that colonial opposition would disregard the distinction between internal and external taxation. 3. British landed gentry. British landed gentry reduced their tax burden, thereby exacerbating fiscal pressure and prompting colonial taxation. 4. Colonial assemblies. Targets of Townshend's political maneuvering to diminish their influence through royal control of salaries. Quotations from key characters. They will laugh at you for your distinctions about regulations of trade. George Grenville on Townshend's assumptions. A sharp critique of the artificial divide between internal and external taxes. Townshend hoped that the Revenue Act would establish a fund to pay governors and other royals' official salaries, freeing them from the Assembly's control. Narrative commentary highlights the Act's deeper aim: to reconfigure colonial governance. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. The Revenue Act undermined colonial autonomy. The Revenue Act sought not merely revenue, but to undermine colonial autonomy by centralizing financial control. 2. The Revenue Act attacked the power of the purse. It attacked the power of the purse, historically the strongest mechanism of colonial legislative resistance. 3. The consequences of the reduced duties on East Indian tea. The reduced duties on East Indian tea to encourage consumption underscore the manipulative economic strategy that further alienated colonial merchants. B. Economic consequences. 1. The Revenue Act's function was revenue extraction. The Act's moderate duties on common goods, glass, paper, tea, reveal that its primary function was revenue extraction, not trade regulation. 2. The Revenue Act backfired economically. It backfired economically, generating only £20,000 out of the projected £37,000 and worsened the Treasury's deficit by £23,000. 3. Manipulative economic strategy. The reduced duties on East Indian tea to encourage consumption underscore the manipulative economic strategy that further alienated colonial merchants. C. Symbolic implications. 1. Imperial paternalism camouflaging taxation. Townshend's efforts exemplify imperial paternalism eroding trust by camouflaging taxation under the guise of trade regulation. 2. Colonial fears of a conspiracy against liberty. The policy resurrected colonial fears of a conspiracy against liberty, deepening ideological divides. 3. Taxation, from economic burden to political subjugation. It catalyzed a shift in colonial interpretation of taxation from economic burden to political subjugation. D. In conclusion, Townshend's financial policies illustrate the complex interplay of fiscal desperation, political ambition, and ideological miscalculation. His failure to distinguish between revenue generation and constitutional principles inflamed colonial resistance and laid the groundwork for more intense confrontations. These policies serves as a pivotal case study in the deterioration of Anglo-American relations. 3. The colonists' reaction to Townshend duties, 1767-1769, a comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. December 1767. John Dickinson publishes letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania framing the Townshend duties as unconstitutional. B. Early 1768. Samuel Adams offers a circular letter from the Massachusetts Assembly denouncing taxation without representation and Parliament's overreach. C. Mid-1768. Virginia Assembly responds with a stronger letter warning against imperial policies that would enslave the colonies. D. 1768. Lord Hillsborough, Secretary of State for the Colonies, orders colonial legislatures not to endorse the circular letter and begins dissolving resistance assemblies. E. August 1768. Boston merchants initiate a no importation agreement to protest British duties. F. 1769. Boycotts spread to other colonies, though unevenly, with only about 40% of British imports ultimately affected. Key characters. 1. John Dickinson, Pennsylvania lawyer and pamphleteer, advocated constitutional restraint in letters from a farmer. 2. Samuel Adams, Massachusetts political leader, strategically moderated the tone of resistance for broader appeal. 3. Lord Hillsborough, British Secretary of State for the Colonies, attempted to suppress intercolonial cooperation through executive mandates. 4. The Sons of Liberty, revitalized grassroots resistance movement central in spreading no importation boycotts. 5. Colonial women. Colonial women played a notable role in supporting boycott efforts, particularly by refusing to purchase British goods. Quotations from key characters. No tax designed to produce revenue could be considered constitutional unless a people's elected representatives voted for it. John Dickinson. Imperial policies had an immediate tendency to enslave them. Virginia Assembly, paraphrased. It was a little better than an incentive to rebellion. Parliamentary review of the circular letter. A political, economic, and a symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. The impact of Dickinson's essay on external taxes. Dickinson's essays provided a legal and philosophical foundation for opposing external taxes, equating them with the unconstitutional Stamp Act. 2. The reaction to Massachusetts' circular letter. The reaction to the Massachusetts circular letter revealed how British efforts to suppress resistance backfired, uniting previously indifferent colonies. 3. Intercolonial political solidarity. The episode demonstrated growing colonial resolve and intercolonial political solidarity, foreshadowing more formal resistance structures like the First Continental Congress. B. Economic consequences. 1. Non-importation agreements. Non-importation agreements aimed to pressure British merchants and manufacturers to lobby for repeal, echoing tactics from the Stamp Act crisis. 2. The boycott imposed real economic strain on British trade. Though partial in scope, the boycott imposed real economic strain on British trade and revealed the potential of collective economic action. C. Symbolic implications. 1. Moral high ground and constitutional legitimacy. Dickinson's restrained rhetoric and the moderate tone of Adams' circular letter emphasized moral high ground and constitutional legitimacy. 2. Non-importation as moral high ground and constitutional legitimacy. Non-importation was portrayed not merely as an economic tool, but as a moral and civic duty aligning private virtue with public resistance. 3. The involvement of women in boycotts. The involvement of women in boycotts broadened the base of the movement, making resistance a community-wide, not merely elite-driven endeavor. D. Conclusion. This chapter of resistance illustrates the evolving sophistication, coordination, and rhetorical strength of colonial opposition. It reveals how legal argumentation, moderate appeals, and economic activism fused into a potent political force. It underscores that by 1769, colonial America had learned to resist not just as fragmented protesters, but as a political society asserting its constitutional identity. 4. Women and Colonial Resistance, 1770. A comprehensive overview. Chronological summary of main events. A. Early 1770. Over 300 upper-class women in Boston publicly denounced the consumption of British tea in protest against the Revenue Act. B. 1770 and following months. Non-consumption agreements expand to include textiles and clothing. C. Throughout 1770, women organized spinning bees, community events showcasing domestic cloth production as a patriotic duty. Public response, widespread colonial and British attention highlights the symbolic and material impact of women's activism. Key characters. 1. The Daughters of Liberty. Patriotic women, especially from the upper classes, who assumed leadership roles in resisting British policies through domestic actions. 2. A named Massachusetts minister celebrated the political virtue of female-led production and symbolic protest. 3. Anonymous New York woman described the mobilization as a fighting army of Amazons armed with spinning wheels. The quotations from key characters. A fighting army of Amazons armed with spinning wheels, New York woman. A powerful metaphor linking traditional female labor with political activism. Women might recover to this country the full and free enjoyment of all our rights, properties, and privileges. This is more than the men have been able to do. Massachusetts minister celebrate women's effectiveness and moral superiority in the resistance effort. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. Broken gender norms of political exclusion. Women's active participation broke gender norms of political exclusion, placing female patriotism at the heart of colonial resistance. 2. The visible proof of national unity. Their actions offered visible proof of national unity, reinforcing the legitimacy and seriousness of American grievances in the eyes of the British public. 3. Transformation of private domestic duties into acts of public defiance. It transformed private domestic duties into acts of public defiance, illustrating how revolution permeated everyday life. B. Economic consequences. 1. The impact of non-consumption. Non-consumption emerges directly by eroding demand, thereby reinforcing the effects of non-importation. 2. Homemade cloth production. Homemade cloth production demonstrated the colonies' ability to sustain themselves economically without dependence on British imports. C. Symbolic implications. 1. Spinning bees as performative symbols of patriotism. Spinning bees became performative symbols of patriotism, celebrating labor, modesty, and national commitment. 2. Redefine female agency. The elevation of spinning and weaving to patriotic acts redefined female agency, integrating moral virtue with revolutionary ideology. 3. The Daughters of Liberty communicated a powerful message of societal unity. The Daughters of Liberty communicated a powerful message of societal unity, suggesting that even those outside the political elite would fight to preserve constitutional liberties. D. Conclusion. This passage illustrates how female participation transformed colonial resistance into a communal and inclusive movement, vital for conveying both the moral resolve and practical capability of the American people. It exemplifies how ideological resistance was embodied in symbolic acts and how gender played a strategic and rhetorical role in pre-revolutionary America. 5. Customs, racketeering, and escalating violence, 1767-1774, a comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. 1767. The establishment of the American Board of Customs Commissioners under Townshend's direction. Expansion of customs personnel and incentive structures. B. Post-1767. Abuses by customs agents begin. Illegal seizures, infringement of sailors' rights, and aggressive enforcement of the Sugar Act. C. 1768, June. Seizure of John Hancock's ship, Liberty, incites a major riot in Boston, leading to the expulsion of customs officers. D. 1767. The establishment of the American Board of Customs Commissioners under Townshend's direction. Expansion of customs personnel and incentive structures. E. 1768-1770. Legal actions against Hancock fail due to lack of evidence and perjury. Colonial opinion shifts towards rejecting all parliamentary lawmaking authority. F. 1770. British government acknowledges abuses, drops smuggling charges against Hancock, and begins customs reform. G. By 1774, broad colonial consensus emerges. Parliament may regulate commerce, but has no legislative authority without colonial representation. Key characters. 1. Charles Townshend, architect of the customs expansion, introduced incentive-based seizure policies. 2. John Hancock, prominent Boston merchant and patriot, symbol of resistance due to his unjust treatment by customs officials. 3. American Board of Customs Commissioners, institutional enforcers of imperial policy widely viewed as corrupt and tyrannical. 4. Sailors and dock workers, victims of property seizures, central participants in retaliatory riots. 5. Sons of Liberty, advocated peaceful resistance, distanced themselves from mob violence while acknowledging public outrage. Quotations from key characters. Dogs of prey, thirsting after the fortune of worthy and wealthy men. Pennsylvania Journal, 1769. A vivid condemnation of informers working for customs agents. Let this be the language of all. No mobs, no confusion, no tumults. A Son of Liberty emphasizes a call for disciplined resistance despite popular anger. Hancock's case revealed that British laws endanger property rights and civil liberties as much as taxes. Massachusetts Commentary. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. The impact of the Hancock's case. The behavior of customs officials and the legal handling of Hancock's case triggered a shift in political ideology. From opposition to taxation without representation, to rejection of all parliamentary authority without colonial consent. 2. The fragility of British legal legitimacy. These events revealed the fragility of British legal legitimacy in colonial eyes and accelerated the radicalization of American constitutional thought. B. Economic consequences. 1. Maritime commerce undermined. The seizure of ships and goods under dubious charges undermined maritime commerce, penalized legitimate traders, and threatened merchants' livelihoods. 2. The customs system as a tool for personal enrichment. Incentivized enforcement converted the customs system into a tool for personal enrichment, violating economic fairness and trust. C. Symbolic implications. 1. The abuse of legal authority became a symbol of tyranny. The abuse of legal authority became a symbol of tyranny. Customs racketeering was not merely a matter of policy, but of moral outrage. 2. The narrative of martyrdom and persecution. Public acts like tarring and feathering informers dramatized colonial anger and reinforced the narrative of martyrdom and persecution. 3. The Liberty Affair. The Liberty Affair epitomized how lawfare, the misuse of legal institutions for political repression, alienated even moderate colonists. D. Conclusion. This episode shows how imperial overreach, economic coercion, and legal manipulation eroded the moral and political fabric binding the colonies to Britain. It is a paradigmatic moment for understanding the transition from protest to revolution. The Hancock incident, in particular, symbolizes the convergence of personal grievance, collective resistance, and ideological transformation. 6. The Boston Massacre, 1769–1770, a comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. Mid-1769. Partial withdrawal of British troops from Boston. Some remain, leading to ongoing civilian military tension. B. February the 22nd, 1770. A customs informer kills 11-year-old Christopher Cedar while firing birdshot at stone-throwing children. C. Post-February the 22nd, 1770. Samuel Adams organizes a large funeral procession to rally anti-British sentiment through communal grief. D. March the 5th, 1770. Tensions culminate in a confrontation at the Boston Customs House. A crowd, led by Cyprus Attucks, provokes British soldiers. A volley of shots results in the death of 5 colonists. E. Post-massacre. Post-massacre, Samuel Adams leads the political exploitation of the incident, branding it the Boston Massacre. F. Spring 1770. To ease tensions, British troops are relocated to a fortified island, and John Adams volunteers to defend the soldiers in court, asserting colonial commitment to legal justice. Key characters. 1. Samuel Adams, political strategist and master propagandist, instrumental in framing both the Cedar and Massacre deaths as martyrdom. 2. John Adams, a future US president and lawyer, defends the British soldier to uphold colonial claims to justice and rule of law. 3. Crispus Attucks, African and Native American seaman, first to die in the Boston Massacre, later memorialized as symbol of American martyrdom. 4. Christopher Cedar, 11-year-old boy killed by a customs informer. His death became a unifying moment of public mourning and resistance. 5. British troops and customs informers, symbols of imperial coercion and impunity. Their actions catalyzed colonial unity against perceived tyranny. Quotations from key characters. My eyes never beheld such a funeral. This shows there are many more lives to spend if wanted in the service of their country. John Adams on Cedar's funeral conveyed the intense emotional and symbolic resonance of the child's death. Americans were forced to confront the possibility that the British government might use naked force to make them pay unconstitutional taxes. Narrative commentary. A pivotal moment of psychological rupture in colonial trust of imperial authority. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. The violent confrontation supplanted legislative protest. The Boston Massacre marked a critical juncture where violent confrontation supplanted legislative protest, confirming colonist fears that Britain would enforce obedience through military coercion. 2. Deepening colonial ideological consolidation. It deepened colonial ideological consolidation, transforming resistance into moral obligation and martyrdom. 3. Maintaining moral and legal high ground. John Adams's courtroom defense of the soldiers exemplified the colonists' effort to maintain moral and legal high ground even amid crisis. B. Economic consequences. 1. The presence of customs officials and taxation enforcers at the roots of the unrest. Though the confrontation was not directly economic, the presence of customs officials and taxation enforcers lay at the root of the unrest. 2. Anger at economic controls. The perception of government agents as aggressors intensified anger at economic control, like the Townshend duties. C. Symbolic implications. 1. The deaths of Cedar and Attucks became foundational myths of the Revolution. The deaths of Cedar and Attucks became foundational myths of the Revolution, blending innocence, racial inclusion, and heroic sacrifice. 2. The power of language and imagery. The term Boston Massacre was itself a propagandistic invention, underlining the power of language and imagery in shaping revolutionary sentiment. 3. Acts of political theatre. The funerals orchestrated by Samuel Adams were acts of political theatre, creating spectacles of unity and shared grievance. D. Conclusion. The Boston Massacre was not simply a tragic episode. It was a defining moment of ideological rupture and collective mobilization, rendering British authority morally illegitimate in the eyes of many colonists. This event is essential to understand how emotion, spectacle, and legal principle converge in the revolutionary process. 7. Repeal of the Townshend Duties, 1770. A comprehensive overview. Chronological summary of main events. A. January 1770. Lord North becomes British Prime Minister, seeks to end American commercial boycott by repealing most Townshend duties. B. April 1770. Parliament repeals all Townshend duties except the tax on tea. C. July 1770. The general non-importation movement collapses due to the partial repeal, though the Sons of Liberty maintain a voluntary boycott of tea. D. Post-1770. Revenue from the tea tax plummets to 1/6 of expectations, undermining the goal of funding royal governors' salaries. E. Post-massacre. Post-massacre, Samuel Adams leads the political exploitation of the incident, branding it the Boston Massacre. F. Ongoing. Colonial dissatisfaction continues. The unresolved tea duty sustains ideological and political tension, signaling a deeper break in Anglo-American loyalty. Key characters. 1. Lord North. Prime Minister. Pragmatic yet insistent on preserving symbolic British sovereignty via the tea tax. 2. The Sons of Liberty. Persist in resisting British taxation, especially targeting tea consumption as an emblematic issue. 3. Colonial politicians. Viewed the retained tea duty as a symbol of continued constitutional subjugation. Quotations from key characters. The tea tax acted like a festering sore that slowly poisoned relations between Britain and the colonies. Narrative commentary. A powerful metaphor encapsulating the symbolic toxicity of retaining the tea tax. A political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. The tea tax as a calculated assertion of parliamentary supremacy. The decision to retain the tea tax, despite repealing other duties, was a calculated assertion of parliamentary supremacy. 2. The tea tax as unacceptable overreach. This act underscored the growing divide. While Britain saw the tax as a necessary affirmation of authority, colonies viewed it as unacceptable overreach. 3. Creation of the Tea Party. The continued existence of the tax, despite widespread resistance, hardened colonial resolve and fostered the condition for the Tea Party and subsequent rebellion. B. Economic consequences. 1. The boycott and rejection of British tea. The boycott and rejection of British tea crippled anticipated revenue, making the tax functionally ineffective but symbolically persistent. 2. The economic impracticability of coercive policy. The failure to generate sufficient income to pay governors' salaries revealed the economic impracticability of coercive policy. C. Symbolic implications. 1. The tea tax remained a moral and political provocation. The tea tax remained a moral and political provocation, a daily reminder of Parliament's unwillingness to relinquish legislative claims over the colonies. 2. Divisions within the colonies. The collapse of the non-importation movement highlighted divisions within the colonies, but the persistence of tea resistance showed that ideological opposition was not extinguished. 3. Irreparable erosion of loyalty. The phrase festering sore captures the slow, irreparable erosion of loyalty, marking a point of no return in colonial British relations. The conclusion. The repeal of most Townshend duties in 1770, while retaining the tea tax, illustrates the fundamental contradiction in British colonial policy. Pragmatic retrenchment paired with symbolic rigidity. This event is vital for understanding how moderate reforms failed to restore colonial loyalty and how symbolic resistance continued to shape revolutionary sentiment. 8. Frontier tensions, 1763-1771. A comprehensive overview. A chronological summary of main events. A. Post-1763. Failure to enforce the proclamation line of 1763 due to population growth and inadequate British revenues, escalating settler violence against Native Americans. B. 1768. Treaty of Fort Stanwix between Britain and the Iroquois, ceding land along the Ohio River, inhabited by Shawnees, Delawares, and Cherokees, to Virginia and Pennsylvania. C. 1766. Armed uprising in western Massachusetts against New York land claims. D. 1769. Emergence of the Green Mountain Boys in New Hampshire Territory, engaging in guerrilla warfare against New York landlords. E. 1771. May the 16th. Battle of Alamance Creek in North Carolina. 2,500 regulators clash with 1,300 colonial militia. The regulators' movement is crushed. F. Post-1771. South Carolina's regulator movement achieves reforms. New courts and jury trials in western areas, prompted by fears of a slave revolt. Key characters. Iroquois Confederacy, collaborators with British negotiators in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Their consent masked the expropriation of other tribes' lands. 2. Shawnees, Delawares, Cherokees. Indigenous group whose lands were ceded without their consent. Many rejected appeasement. 3. Green Mountain Boys. Militant settlers in Vermont territory resisting New York's claims, proto-nationalist in character. 3. North Carolina regulators. Armed Western settlers resisting political corruption and under-representation. 4. South Carolina regulators sought judicial reform to protect frontier communities from lawlessness. Quotations from key characters. Land pressures and the lack of adequate revenue from the colonies left the British government helpless to enforce the proclamation of 1763. Descriptive commentary highlights the structural failure of imperial authority. Convinced that appeasement would not stop colonial expansion. Characterization of Shawnee and Cherokee resistance indicates a growing radicalism in indigenous strategy. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. Exposed imperial weakness and eroded native trust. The British Crown's inability to enforce treaties or protect indigenous lands exposed imperial weakness and eroded native trust. 2. Internal colonial divisions revealed deep fractures within settler society. Internal colonial divisions reveal deep fractures within settler society, including rival colonial charters and the marginalization of frontier populations. 3. The regulator uprisings foreshadowed popular unrest. The regulator uprising foreshadowed popular unrest and set a precedent for challenging established authority, even that of local elites. B. Economic consequences. 1. Competition over land as a primary economic motivator for violence and protest. Competition over land was the primary economic motivator for violence and protest, especially where legitimate land titles were disputed. 2. Lawlessness and banditry as a threat to agricultural investment and colonial stability. In South Carolina, lawlessness and banditry threaten agricultural investment and colonial stability, prompting reforms under duress. C. Symbolic implications. 1. A three-party crisis of legitimacy. These events reflect a three-party crisis of legitimacy: imperial, British governance, colonial, coastal assemblies, and inter-settler overlapping claims and inequalities. 2. An incipient regional nationalism. The rise of groups like the Green Mountain Boys represents an incipient regional nationalism resisting both imperial and colonial oversight. 3. Indigenous resistance and persistent colonial expansionism. Indigenous resistance, although largely unsuccessful in immediate terms, highlighted persistent colonial expansionism and the fragility of diplomatic arrangements like Fort Stanwix. D. Conclusion. The frontier tensions of the late 1760s and early 1770s underscore how the American Revolution was not solely a metropolitan rebellion, but also a crisis of governance and justice on the periphery. These developments illuminate the intersection of settler colonialism, indigenous dispossession, and intra-colonial conflicts, all of which must be integrated into a holistic understanding of the revolutionary era. 9. The Committees of Correspondence, 1772-1774. A comprehensive overview. Chronological summary of main events. A. June 1772. The customs schooner Gaspee runs aground near Providence. That night, over 100 colonists burned the ship in retaliation for its role in custom Racketeering. B. Mid-1772. British authorities attempt to send suspect to England for trial, alarming colonists over the erosion of jury rights. C. Fall 1772. Lord North moves to pay royal governors directly from customs revenue, undermining the authority of colonial assemblies. D. Late 1772. Samuel Adams initiated a network of committees of correspondence in Massachusetts to coordinate colonial resistance. E. June 1773. Adams publishes letters from Governor Thomas Hutchinson revealing intent to curtail colonial liberties, confirming fears of a conspiracy. F. March 1773. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee proposed Virginia establish committees of correspondence. Key characters. 1. Samuel Adams, architect of the committees of correspondence, instrumental in spreading resistance and political education. 2. Lord North, a British Prime Minister who advanced plans to financially emancipate royal officials from colonial legislatures. 3. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, Massachusetts governor whose private letters proposed reducing civil liberties, reinforcing fears of British tyranny. 3. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee. Virginia leaders who institutionalized intercolonial coordination through their own committee proposals. 4. Benjamin Franklin leaked Hutchinson's letters, provoking colonial outrage and validating suspicions. Quotations from key characters. An abridgment of what are called English liberties and a great restraint of natural liberty. From Governor Hutchinson's letters, emblematic of elite disdain for colonial rights. Colonial allegiance was becoming conditional and could no longer be assumed. A historiographical judgment of the waning of imperial loyalty. Political, economic, and symbolic value. A. Political significance. 1. From spontaneous protest to institutionalized resistance. Marked a transition from spontaneous protest to institutionalized resistance. 2. The erosion of trust in imperial authority. Showcased the erosion of trust in imperial authority, especially after revelations of internal British intentions to abridge liberties. 3. Grassroots political participation. Committees fosters grassroots political participation, drawing even small towns into an organized, ideologically unified movement. 4. Precursor to revolutionary governance. Establish a precursor to revolutionary governance, paving the way for the Continental Congress. B. Economic consequences. 1. The Gaspee Incident. The Gaspee Incident and custom enforcement policies underscored colonial resentment against economic exploitation and lack of due process in commercial matter. 2. Diminishing the economic leverage of elected assemblies. Royal attempts to pay governors from customs revenue would diminish the economic leverage of elected assemblies, prompting widespread resistance. C. Symbolic implications. 1. The burning of the Gaspee and Hutchinson's letters. The burning of the Gaspee and Hutchinson's letters became emblems of tyranny and elite betrayal. 2. The creation of the committees as a symbol of colonial solidarity. The creation of the committees is best understood as a symbol of colonial solidarity, echoing classical republican ideals of civic vigilance and moral duty. 3. British conspiracy against liberty as the dominant ideological lens. By 1773, the narrative of a British conspiracy against liberty was no longer French. It had become the dominant ideological lens through which many Americans interpreted imperial actions. D. Conclusion. The committees of correspondence were a watershed in the evolution of colonial resistance. They represent a shift from episodic protest to systemic mobilization and ideological clarity. This episode is crucial in tracing the genealogy of American independence. It reveals how institutions of dissent were constructed long before the first shots of war were fired, and how political ideas were translated into durable revolutionary structures. Thank you for watching this video on Mega Easy English, the American Revolution, Chapter 3, Era of Anglo-American Crisis. If you like the video, do not forget to subscribe and to recommend the video to other people. The next episode will be the American Revolution, Chapter 4, Towards Independence. See you next time on Mega Easy English.